Out in the desert. It was in a place called Al Wasl, somewhere near where Burj Khalifa is now.
Yes.
It was, at that time, way beyond the edge of development. And did a scheme there. And I came out, and so I particularly, one of my trips out, I took lots of photographs and did sketches of Arish construction, photographed traditional houses and so on, at that time from the outside. And it was only afterwards that I got the chance to go and measure a wind tower house. In fact, all I was asked to do was measure a wind tower. And when I went into the house, which was the Bakash house, it was so really beautiful that I asked the family if I could measure the whole house, if they would mind.
Yes.
And I did so every evening after work until I was a young boy who was helping me measure the house and holding the tape and arranging which rooms I could go into at which times. Eventually he said to me, my father asked if you're finished yet, and I took the hint. And luckily I had taken so many photographs and I had enough survey information that I could spend the next sort of 9-10 months drawing it up in my little free time. Verstakir was under threat, and so I was aware that when I was doing that survey that I was recording something that may not be there for very long. And there was a slight irony to it because John Harris, who employed me at the time, helped sponsor the publication. He thought that it was important to do so, and ironically it was his project, the new Diwan for Sheikh Rashid, which he never used, which demolished half of the Bastakir, including the house I surveyed. So I was very glad that I had done that. But it was, there was a perception of it that it was, these old buildings were undesirable, that they weren't really fit for habitation. They couldn't be air conditioned, they were damp. And I don't think at the time people really valued them, the cultural qualities, which were very, very high, but they were secondary to the discomfort, the dampness, the smell of salt, and they were old-fashioned. There was a sense of moving forward, looking forward, and you've got to remember that life in the time when those houses were being lived in, where you had Arish houses alongside the coral and sea stone houses, life was very hard here. There was a really high mortality rate.
Yes.
A pregnant mother might well die giving birth, or the child may not survive, and there was so very high mortality rates. Sickness there was very little, no sophisticated medicine here. So.
Yes, I think
I think all of that was associated together, not just the architecture. I think that there was a sense that there was a need to improve our qualities of life here. So to be able to move into an air-conditioned apartment where you didn't rely just on a wind tower, if you were lucky enough to have one, to be able to have a fridge, to have a cooker, and rather than using flushing toilets.
Yes. Yeah, but people also it was an expectation that it was now their right, and maybe that's seen particularly from the Abu Dhabi end, that the population had just also experienced a change of ruler, and how Sheikh Zayed was greeted as the one who will bring all those changes that people had already heard about, that people in other parts of the Gulf where the oil industry had arrived earlier, and they knew what to expect. They knew how to expect hospitals and roads and schools and all of that, airports, but also they knew how to expect how to live. And therefore it was almost
they demanded
a demand, and in Abu Dhabi certainly the demand was very quickly fulfilled, was met very quickly, and these low-cost houses were rolled out in groups of houses for groups of traditional tribal communities, and people expected that, and so it was also, one could see, even in 1968, we could see that by 1969, the souk in Abu Dhabi and one of the beautiful sort of old-style houses built of coral stone, which was the customs house. We would see this will go, and the bulldozer, surely, by 1969, it had all gone.
The Arish houses, the traditional houses, for them, it's like something related to the old.
Yes.
And being poor.
And being poor, yes.
Yeah.
So let us demolish it, let us forget it and move to another houses or other modern things. Yes.
For me, one of the interesting things is that where the plot of land was finite, the house was pushed towards the back. The front is courtyard for the car.
Yes.
And that certainly, first of all, tells me that people wanted to go from the outside, from living close to outside, to the sand, to, the inside is where life happens indoors.
This is what I call it shift in value, shift in social value. In the old days, we used to concentrate more in the inner space, okay? And there is like a clear separation between outside and inside.
Yeah.
There is no direct look from the outside to the inner side. Always there is barrier. Okay?
Yes.
We call it in traditionally radda, recess. Nobody from outside can directly look to the courtyard. As you said, by the time things become, instead of having the garden inside the house, the garden shifted to be outside the house.
We had a group of people came here in 1949 to find out what sort of materials were available for building. We needed to build camps where we were going to drill the first well. And there was cement was available, yes.
Imported from
Japan.
From Japan. Okay.
And it was said that the Japanese cement was cheaper than the English cement, and it was not so good. Well, never mind. And then, of course, there was the jus, which our people inspected. Jus factories, they described them. I was in Dubai and Sharjah. There wasn't one in Abu Dhabi. And they said the jus was very inferior quality and therefore not really much use. So that was cement and jus both condemned. But they did say that you could use the cement to make blocks, cement blocks, but you would have to use the beach sand, which therefore you were using saline, rather salty water, because the sand of the desert was far too rounded and hopeless. At least the beach sand in many places was angular and therefore. And they said, as for the coral, well, it was too expensive. A cubic meter of coral was quoted as being 9 dirhams. Now, Rhine rupees in those days. But when you think that that was the daily wage for a skilled carpenter was 9, so that was a lot of money. Or a watchman, for example, would earn 2 rupees a day. This was 9 rupees for a cubic meter of not that much coral. So coral was also out as a building material. It was too expensive. So in the end, of course, what the company did was they made the what we call breeze blocks, and they also brought in the Nissen huts from the military huts, which were used all over the place by the British military. And we did not use the Arish at all. It lacked strength, and anyway, the winds blew straight through it.
And the fire risk.
And the fire risk came also later, yes, but that also applied to the Basra board, of course.
But also there wouldn't have been enough date palms handy by the coast.
No, and
not enough to use for construction.
In fact, a lot of this sort of stuff was imported either from Basra, from Iraq, or from Baluchistan, and wood was imported from India, of course. There was very little here, really. And as for the standard of the labor to construct anything, build anything, well, they found that there were no contractors in Abu Dhabi, build contractors in Abu Dhabi available at that time. And in Dubai and Sharjah, they found a total of 5, but they were somewhat dubious about the whole arrangement.
That was in 49.
In 49, yes.
My very first very strong impression of Dubai, and which totally seduced me, and was the relationship between the souk and the water, and on the edge of the creek.
Yes.
It was really special.
was
The
magic.
water lapped against the houses. You know, it's sort of separate now. Just a little bit of it left. The Bastakir, the door was already reclaimed land in front of the Bastakir with warehouses. So the Bastakir didn't have that same relationship with the water. Shindaga did. Still, Shindaga was right close to the water. And, you know, the Maktoum Bridge was just one lane each way. So there was always traffic jams going up to the clock tower roundabout,
Yes.
which was really a very nice thing. It was the landmark.
It was a landmark.
But this relationship was missing in Abu Dhabi. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
And that is why people don't even now know and remember that there were also wind tower houses in Abu Dhabi, but they weren't so spectacular. You couldn't look at them, you know, across a creek or across the water. And there were fewer, but there were wind tower houses in the same fashion.
And that
not quite so
relationship
big.
between the boats and the souk and the water. I mean,
It
the
just
architecture
didn't
was the
exist.
boats.
Yeah.
No, it was, and it was something very special for Dubai Creek. And I think Sharjah Creek, though, never saw it. I only saw I saw it from inside the souk. I never had that view across because it was just a sandbar.
Sandbelt, yeah.
And it was a very strong architecture, and the density of wind towers in those three places, and with the souk area in Shindaga and in the Bastakir.
But one of the drawbacks of the Arish, of course, particularly out in the desert and also up in the mountains where they had Arish, was that it housed gentlemen who were not welcome. Once we were camped by some water in Wadi Al Ghor, and someone came past, a local. Actually, he was wearing running shoes and he was out for a run. And he said, "How can you camp here? Come and stay in my house." And he had, of course, a modern-day shabia. He said, "There are scorpions here and there are snakes here. It's dangerous."
Traditional building materials don't comply with any codes.
Right.
So if you want to build, you know, a public building,
Of course.
you know, I think, you know, what
to
can we
start
do?
from
We
scratch.
have to start from scratch.
That was the problem they had in the old fort, which ultimately the entire old and new and everything was part of the Center for Documentation and Exhibition areas. And it was always a question of how could one have, you know, microfilms, thousands of miles of microfilm and all of this in this old building. So eventually the place was rehoused, the center was rehoused.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, one also has to maybe point out that books were accumulated in the center inside the old fort, which was, after all, the rulers, the center of rule and the center of government. And in that place, a library was established and archive material was brought from other nations' archives at a time when there were no roads in Abu Dhabi. I mean, just imagine in '68, this venture was started just because one wanted to have the archive material to evidence what is what, also on borders and the local history in general. But to, you know, for Sheikh Zayed and with, Ahmed Khalifa Suedi was the sort of supervised it all. And to have this idea, we now have something like that. Before one had even a Ministry of Justice or any of this. I think was in hindsight one can see what a sort of forward-looking idea.
Yes.
But I was thinking, you mentioned concrete, cement floors and so on. Of course, cement floors were a godsend to many people because in a Arish you have a sand floor, or if you're over towards Alain, the mountains, or as we've seen in Oman, you have a mud floor. Well, something is spilt on it. What happens? I suppose in the sand you turn the sand over. On the mud, it soaks in. But a concrete floor, you can wipe it clean.
Yes.
Wonderful. It's
Hygienic.
much more hygienic, much more satisfactory.
Traditionally, in the Emirati house, there are three separation in the space: semi-public, semi-private, and the private. Always the majlis and the traditional house between the semi-public and semi-private. It is like between the outside and the inside. Although there is a great change on the facade of the houses, visual part of the houses, okay, externally, the space itself configuration is still there, mainly in terms of majlis. Always majlis become part of external and internal. It's never been in the middle of the house. And when I talk about majlis, I talk about the main reception hall. Okay, so always the main reception hall, majlis itself, situated on the part of outside, inside. Although the house is developed, although most of the houses now become like villa, but the majlis always situated in the corner between the outside and the
accessible
inside.
place.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
But what has changed is that what was the courtyard, which was the breathing space of the house, and it was a climatic modifier, and it was a place where there would be some goats probably, and some trees, and chickens. It was very private. It was where the women were and the children were brought up, safe from the eyes of strangers, and safe from the street. So and it's a very symbolic part of the house, and the majlis would be quite close to it. But as you say, on that fringe between the public and the private. And now what has happened is that the courtyard has come to the outside. It becomes a perimeter garden. The garden becomes something surrounding the house. And the villas are much more in the Western style of houses, as a block in a space away from the boundary. But the majlis still sits on the boundary. And that hasn't changed. That's the most enduring part. I think that's really interesting. The other change that I observed is that when I really studied the House of the Bastakir, and you see it in old quarters if you go to Nizwa and so on, the houses are absolutely plain on the outside traditionally, apart from the entrance. The entrance may have a very elaborate door. It may have a portico and some sort of porch, which is more elaborate. And you have the wind towers, which obviously became a symbol of celebrating life or wealth or success. But everything else on the house doesn't, on the outside. All of the decoration is in the courtyard, and there can be very beautiful decoration, but it's only visible to the family. That has changed because the modern villa, all the decoration is on the outside, and the wealthier the family, undoubtedly, they're more ostentatious and more life is celebrated, and there's a richness which we wouldn't have seen 50 years ago.
Yeah. And still the entrance is still, as it is in the traditional house, still has an important element.
Very important,
currently.
yes.
Always there is emphasis on the entrance of the house. People always reflect their status by the entrance, by making more decoration to the entrance of the house.
The door, people actually would take nothing else, but they take the door from one building to the next, to the new house.
Yeah.